Vamos iniciar nossa sessão especial de hoje, cujo título é Novos rumos para a teoria keynesiana. Estão presentes, pela ordem da apresentação, o professor Philip Arestis, o professor John McCombie e o professor Dominique Pilliron. Feito isso, passemos a palavra, então, ao professor Philip.
So what I would like to talk for the next half hour or so is in a way, it is not unrelated to what Paul was saying yesterday about Keynesianism and what is happening at the moment in the world of economics. Now, in the world of economics, as Paul suggested yesterday, as we talk, we don't have the Keynesianism in any way whatsoever. What we have instead is what people call the new consensus in macroeconomics. And when you say consensus, of course, you imply that everybody agrees with this particular paradigm, which is far from the truth. There are a lot of us who violently disagree with this consensus, but it is consensus within a certain group of people who call themselves orthodox or conventional economists. It is a new consensus macroeconomics. It's another way of saying new Keynesian economics. And I hope that by the end of this half hour, I will have shown you that this new consensus macroeconomics or new Keynesian macroeconomics, especially the latter, is a misnomer, because really what it is about pre-Keynesian economics, nothing to do with Keynes's economics. So the way I am going to go about it is to have this short introduction and then talk a little bit about the economics of this new consensus macroeconomics, its theory, and then its economic policy implications. And then I want to talk a little bit about a critique, always from the Keynesian point of view, and then hopefully summarize and conclude. Now, this new consensus macroeconomics can be summarized, and I'm sure most of you might have seen these three relationships that summarizes these new consensus macroeconomics. I like to present it in 6 equations, only because I think it's more important to talk about an open economy, but it doesn't matter whether you think in terms of 3 equations or 6 equations. The basics are the important thing, and those basics can be found in the first 3 equations that I have put on this particular slide. Let me just very quickly explain the symbols and the theory behind and the assumptions that these people make in order to produce their theory. Y superscript G in the first equation is output gap, the difference between current output and potential output. Capital E in front of a variable is, of course, expected value of that particular variable. Capital R is nominal rate of interest. Expected PT plus 1 is expected inflation in the next period, so that lowercase p is inflation, and RER is real exchange rate. That relationship, the first on that particular slide, resembles what we might call the IS relationship, the one which we were all taught maybe in our first year economics, where you have a relationship which is an equilibrium relationship between various interest rates and levels of income at which there is equilibrium between investment and savings. This particular relationship, however, is very, very different from that IS, the old IS, if you like, the one that we are probably more familiar with. This particular relationship comes from a number of assumptions which these people make, and it relates to some extent to what Paul was saying yesterday about the various assumptions that people make. It is based essentially on an intertemporal optimization of a utility function by the representative individual. And this intertemporal optimization comes from the utility function which is optimized subject to the constraint, where the constraint is how the economy works. And how the economy works depends on the individuals, the person who is doing the optimization, how he or she views how the macroeconomy works. And once you've optimized intertemporally through time, then you get that relationship. So it's a kind of reduced form of that intertemporal optimization. In that intertemporal optimization, there is a very, very important condition which is imposed by the proponents. That is the so-called transversality condition, which means that all agents are credit worthy. The implication of that credit worthiness is that you do not need to have a banking sector. So in this particular paradigm, there are no banks. And because there are no banks, there are no monetary aggregates. So in all these relationships which I have summarized on this particular slide, there is no monetary aggregates. The further implication of that is that if everybody is so credit worthy and therefore you don't need banks, there is absence, complete absence of what Paul was saying yesterday in terms of liquidity preference. So Paul was absolutely right to play around with the liquidity preference, to emphasize its importance in terms of Keynesian economics, and complete absence of it in this particular way of thinking about macroeconomics. So when you put all those together, that's what you get. You get that relationship. People call it as the new IS relationship, and what it means is really the important thing, two important aspects to emphasize: the fact that real rate of interest affects economic activity as it is translated under the output gap. There is an impact on economic activity from what happened yesterday. Expectations of economic activity are important in terms of current output gap, and also the real exchange rate is important as you might expect. So that's the IS, that's the aggregate demand equation as it is used by the new consensus macroeconomics. Then there is a Phillips curve, the equation number 2, which is a sort of familiar Phillips curve, but there are some assumptions hidden behind this relationship. Two important assumptions. The first one is that that particular Phillips curve is vertical in the long run. And you get that verticality of the long-run Phillips curve by assuming that B2 plus B3 plus B4 is always equal to 1. So although in the short run you get a trade-off between inflation and economic activity, in the long run that relationship is vertical. And that's a very, very important assumption in this particular way of thinking about economics. Remove that assumption and a lot of this theory has disappeared. The third relationship is what we call the monetary policy rule. How does the central bank behave when they change their nominal rate of interest, that rate of interest which is under their grip, capital R in equation number 3. And what is important on the right-hand side, that couple of things. The first one is Pt minus 1 minus P superscript T. What that means is very simple, that current inflation, Pt minus 1, or inflation yesterday, in essence, current inflation, as it differs from inflation target, the inflation target which the central bank would have to hit, when there is a difference between those two, then the central bank changes the nominal rate of interest, capital R. And they might take into account this output gap, not very important in terms of that particular relationship in most central banks, although there are exceptions, and we can talk about that later. RT minus 1 is the lagged dependent variable, and it is there to merely say that central banks normally, when they wish to change the rate of interest, they don't do so automatically and by the full amount. They go about changing the rate of interest in a gradual way. But most important of all, I think, in this particular relationship, is that R star it is that rate of interest which we get in the long run once the central bank has hit the inflation target, and once, as a result of that, the output gap, y superscript g, is equal to 0. So we reach a steady long-run equilibrium, and that R star is, in effect, the long-run equilibrium real interest rate. And the question is, for the central bank, the difference between RT and RR star becomes of paramount importance. If we are not at the RR star, then that R, nominal R, would have to change so that the economy would move towards that RR star. And here is the first criticism of this particular framework of thinking about macroeconomics. How the hell do you know what RR star is? There was a conference in Cambridge last year, and we had the governor of the Bundesbank, the German central bank, and he was talking about this RR star, and he went through all the attempts by central banks and other people to establish a way of ascertaining what this so important variable RR star might be. Can we have any notion, any idea of what it might be? And he was bitterly complaining that there you have this RR star variable which is so important to us central bankers, he was saying, and yet we have no way of ascertaining precisely what this RR star might be. So there you have a problem in terms of that particular variable. The other three equations are very simple. The determination of the real exchange rate is through through the differences of our real rate of interest in relation to the rest of the world real rate of interest, capital account, CA, and expected real exchange rate. Then there is this relationship for the current account, which is simply made a function of the real exchange rate, output gap of the country you are talking about and the rest of the world. And finally, you have this relationship between, it's just a definition of the nominal exchange rate with respect to the real exchange rate. How does this model works in words? Forget the symbols. To explain it, let's take a situation where the economy is at a position where the current inflation is not quite the same as the target inflation which the central bank would have to meet. Let us assume, for the sake of the argument, that current inflation is above the target. Then the first thing that the central bank would do is, and I forgot to mention, this central bank that we are talking about in relation to this model is an independent central bank. The theory would have you to have an independent central bank, like the Bank of Brazil, became independent in 1999, if I remember properly. The Bank of England became independent in 1997, which is slightly different from the independence of the Federal Reserve System, which became independent in 1913, if I remember properly, but with different mandate. The Federal Reserve System has got a dual mandate, both inflation and output. Unlike the Bank of England and the Bank of Brazil, and I think there are great similarities there, where the mandate is very single. It's just hitting an inflation target. Differences also exist with another independent, the most independent central bank in the entire world, which is the European Central Bank, where again they have a target of inflation at the back of their minds, which is below but near to 2%. But the way they go about it is very, very different from the way that the Brazilian Central Bank and the Bank of England. But in all this, these central banks are independent, and they have to be independent according to the argument of these people because of this time inconsistency problem. That central banks sometimes they are determined to fight inflation, but because of elections, the government says, no, you are not going to worry about inflation yet, wait until after we've been elected. time inconsistency problem. And when you have a central bank which is independent, they're not going to listen to the politicians. And therefore, you've got to have this notion of independent central bank. By the way, I'm not quite sure how many people have realized that the independence of a central bank, is not something which was invented all suddenly in 1977 by Kitland and Prescott, who wrote about the importance of an independent central bank, and then Rockoff argued very strongly that this central bank should be extremely conservative. The first person who talked about an independent central bank was, of course, John Maynard Keynes, who in the 1910s began to talk about the importance of having an independent central bank. And formally speaking, he wrote about it in 1932 when we have in London a periodical which is called the New Statesman. And in September 1932, Keynes was asked by this periodical to respond to a document which the then Labour Party government prepared for their conference in October of that year, 1932. And that document was talking about, should we nationalize the Bank of England, which was a private institution from 1694 until then, it was a private institution. Should we indeed nationalize the whole commercial banking sector? And Keynes was asked to respond to that particular document. And Keynes said, I don't care what you do about the commercial banks because, you are a socialist party. If you want to nationalize them, go ahead, but it's not so important. What is important is that you should nationalize the Bank of England, and not only nationalize the Bank of England, but make it independent from the politicians. Monetary policy is a very, very difficult animal, and you have to have experts who understand monetary policy. People like Paul, who know about monetary policy and appreciate the problems. They are the people who should manipulate whatever the monetary instrument might be in order to achieve your objectives. That's what Keynes was saying in 1932. But Keynes, of course, although he was talking about an independent central bank, he was not talking about the central bank having inflation as their primary objective. He was not talking about inflation targeting. He was talking about how an independent central bank, in conjunction with other policies which the government might have in place, to achieve high levels of economic activity, high levels of employment. Of course, inflation is a problem which ought to be looked after. For Keynes at that time, the instrument to be used for inflation was the exchange rate, because the situation was such in England at the time that the exchange rate was causing these problems. As a matter of fact, in 1946, the Bank of England was nationalized, and it is nationalized to this day, but of course, people didn't listen to Keynes to make it independent. It was in May 1997 when the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, our finance minister, and current Prime Minister decided to give independence to the Bank of England. So I thought that's an important footnote to what I'm trying to say in terms of this particular framework and the difference between that and Keynesian economics. So, going back, we assume that inflation is above the inflation target, and we have the central bank increasing the nominal rate of interest in an attempt to achieve this target of inflation. Current inflation is above the target. The increase in the nominal rate of interest, the increase in that capital R, we look where else capital R appears, and it is in the first equation. And we have that it's very important to know what happens to capital R minus expected inflation tomorrow. And the assumption, another assumption that these people make is that there is price and wage rigidity in the short run. Therefore, when the nominal rate of interest goes up, that real rate of interest would also go up. It's not going to remain unchanged. It's going to go up. That increase is going to affect your economic activity, Y superscript G. The change in Y superscript G in the Phillips Curve relationship in the second equation would produce inflation, pressures on inflation to go down. And therefore, to the extent that that change in the nominal rate of interest is sufficient, in the long run, the only impact of that change in capital R would be on inflation. But there is another important factor in that particular relationship, which is expectations of inflation. This is a new item, a new variable, if you like, which is introduced in this discussion, whereby to the extent that the central bank can affect that expected inflation, then you have another important variable in terms to talk about. And here we have a fantastically new theory which the governor of the Bank of England has labeled as the Maradona theory of interest rate determination. You don't need me to explain who Maradona is, of course. But what you need me to explain is what the hell does Maradona have with this theory of interest rate determination. Let me explain. There was a football match between England and Argentina. Not Brazil, Argentina. And the score was 2-0 to Argentina. But what is important from this point of view, it's the way these goals were scored. The first goal, you remember, Maradona used his hand.
Has never been proved.
All right, okay, let's move from Argentina to Brazil. The same goal was scored by somebody called Adriano. Three weeks ago or so. So the point is that is a time inconsistency problem. It's a foul. It shouldn't happen in that particular way. But the second goal, from the point of view we are talking about, is much more interesting. Why? Well, you see, what Maradona did at the time, he took the ball in his own half, and he went straight and scored the second goal against England. How the hell did he manage that? Well, he was very good in terms of expectations. He assumed that some of the English players go this way, some others would go that way, so if I go straight on, very comfortably, without exerting too much influence on my capacity of running, I score a goal, and that's what Maradona did. So that's the Maradona theory of interest rate determination. Translated into central bank jargon, what it means is that to the extent that the central bank is sufficiently credible, and we, economic agents, believe that when they say I'm going to reduce the rate of inflation through changes in the rate of interest, because I am very credible, I will manage it very well, thank you very much, then we are all persuaded by the ability of the central bank to do so, and consequently, when we realize that that is what is happening, we are going to dampen our expectations of inflation, and therefore the actual inflation rate would be lower, with the central bank not having to increase the rate of interest by as much as if there were no credibility, the credibility argument in place. So, like Maradona, who didn't try all that much to score the second goal, similarly, central banks, to the extent that they affect that inflation expectations variable, then the central bank's job becomes extremely boring. And our governor of the governor of the Bank of England was saying, to the extent that we are successful in that way, monetary policy becomes an extremely boring argument. Of course, we know today as Paul, I think, was alluding to yesterday, this day and age monetary policy is by far boring. It's extremely exciting and interesting to watch what is happening. But that's how this model, in a nutshell, that's how this model operates. Price stability is paramount. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Therefore, we can only fight inflation through manipulating a monetary instrument. Monetary instrument? Money supply? What happened to the money supply? Well, of course, we know what happened to the money supply. Even central bankers and others, I think on that score, and I hope Paul agrees with me, we Keynesians, we won a little bit, in the sense that even central banks realize that manipulating the money stock has got problems. First of all, money supply could easily be endogenous, and therefore, if it is endogenous, it's something which you cannot control because it is endogenous, forget it. Secondly, the financial innovations which we had in the 70s and early 80s produce an instability in the demand for money. But if you have an unstable demand for money, it means that if you were able to change the monetary stock, then you lose the knowledge as to how a change in your monetary stock will affect your ultimate objective, which is inflation. You just do not know. Money demand had become so unstable that we lost it. And therefore, controlling the money supply is hopeless. If you try to do so, you have other problems. And the problems we did have in England, in the United States, in Chile, in Israel, and many other countries where these attempts were tried, resulted in huge unemployment and all sorts of other problems. So people, the proponents of this particular theoretical framework, they thought, if we cannot do the job through manipulating the money supply, then there is only one other instrument left, and that's the rate of interest. And it's a much better instrument because we can establish a direct relationship, as I tried to explain, between changes in the rate of interest and changes in your inflation. And to summarize the argument, when you have inflation, you change the rate of interest. There is a little bit of an impact on the real economic activity in the short run, but in the long run, the impact is only on inflation, and inflation only. Therefore, all these arguments that Paul was talking about yesterday in terms of neutrality of money, sales law, all these things, all these assumptions are very, very relevant to this particular framework that I am trying to explain for us. And from that point of view, this new consensus in macroeconomics, instead of taking us a step forward, it takes us a huge step backward. In fact, it takes us before Keynes. So I would label this way of attempting to do macroeconomics as a pre-Keynesian consensus, or whatever you like to label it, rather than a consensus in macroeconomics, a modern consensus in macroeconomics. And consequently, to the extent that I can persuade you on that, what Paul was saying yesterday about Keynesian economics becomes very, very important, and hopefully with more effort from a lot of us, we might produce a change in the thinking of people before we need to have such a huge crisis, as Paul was saying, when Keynesian economics might become relevant. But I tend to agree with Paul that it would take a lot more, thank you, before we reach that stage. Now, what are the problems with this approach? And there are a lot of problems with this approach, and I'll separate them, A, in terms of theory, and B, in terms of policy. In terms of theory, I've already argued that there is no liquidity preference in this particular framework. It is completely absent. Central banks change the rate of interest, as I indicated, and the explicit assumption is that change in the rate of interest would change in a very nice way and stable way the rest of the structure of interest rates in the economy. Other short-term interest rates would change in a similar like fashion, and long-term interest rates would change equivalently. That's the assumption they make. But you don't need me to tell you that that does not work in the real world. Our Prime Minister, only yesterday, on Tuesday, he invited to his office a number of significant bankers who work in the City of London, and he had a very, very important message. Please, 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 reduce the rate of interest along the lines of the Bank of England. Why did he have to do that? For the very simple reason that the structure of interest rates does not work in any way near what this particular framework suggests. And the reason is because there is no notion of liquidity preference in this particular framework. There are no banks in this new consensus macroeconomics. No wonder, therefore, we have the problems that we've been experiencing over the last 80 years or so. There is this vertical Phillips curve. Sometimes I fight very hard with myself to find any evidence that in fact this Phillips curve is so vertical as these people suggest. They tell us that Nauru is a supply-side variable unaffected by aggregate demand. What evidence is there? Well, a lot of evidence which I have seen is what Malcolm Sawyer and I published in a number of papers where we try to say, hang on a minute, sometimes unemployment cannot be reduced unless you have a sufficient amount of capital stock. Consequently, can we theorize that your Nauru is also related to capital stock, so that changes in the rate of interest affect investment, changes in investment, of course, affect capital stock, and that could easily affect Nauru. The theory is very simple. In terms of the empirics, can we have any evidence? And our evidence is that using relevant data for the entire European Union countries, we conclude that, yes, the capital stock is a very important and significant variable in Nauru, and consequently, this assumption that Nauru is a supply-side determined variable only disappears. It goes through the roof. Nauru, we are told, is affected by flexible labor markets. Every month, the governor of the European Central Bank tries to remind us, or to remind his colleagues, of the importance of having flexibility in the labor markets throughout Europe. Because he says, we, the European Central Bank, are trying to fight inflation through manipulation of the rate of interest. Can I remind us? The European Central Bank has never been able to meet their target of 2% by manipulating the rate of interest. As we talk, the inflation rate in the euro area is near to 3% rather than anything else. And then he goes on to say, but if you want growth in the European Union, the thing you have to do is to introduce flexibility in your labor markets, and then everything will be wonderful. And there is a lot of evidence, actually, to say that, all right, let's compare the very inflexible European markets with the very flexible American markets and see whether we can learn anything from there. And the entire evidence that I have seen, especially done by Paul de Gros from the University of, a certain university in Belgium, Leuven University, I think it's called, in Belgium, a lot of empirical work comparing the United States and the European Union, euro area and the European Union more generally speaking, concludes that there is no difference whatsoever in terms of how you do policy, whether it is flexible labor markets or otherwise. So again, this notion that Nauru is affected significantly by flexible labor markets is not on. Price stability has been associated with benefits to the economies that are pursuing it. I think that is to some extent true, because if you look at the last 10 years or so, we've had price stability in the world. We've had price stability in the countries which have been pursuing inflation targeting. But then, you see, problem is that if you look at countries which have not been pursuing inflation targeting, they have been as successful, and in some cases even more successful. So how do you explain that? Should we have this enormous faith in inflation targeting? And the answer to us is that no. Inflation targeting has not been successful for the very or as successful as people think about it, because other countries have also been successful using other ways of fighting inflation. So what is it at the end of the day? We try to guess, and this is only a guesswork, that maybe the nice decade, as our governor, the governor of the Bank of England, has labeled the 10 years from sort of until recently, non-inflationary, consistent, expansionary decade. So we call it the nice decade, is due not to the inflation targeting attempts by a number of central banks. As we talk, there are about 95 central banks who are pursuing these particular ways that we've been talking about for the last half hour or so, but it must be to some other reason. And the other reason that we think might be important, but a lot of work is needed, is probably globalization. There is also some policy questions. There is insufficient attention paid to the exchange rate, and you know, in the United Kingdom, for example, we've had a lot of problems, a lot of imbalances into the system. What we had, because the interest rate was pushed upwards, we had this enormous appreciation in the exchange rate. And that appreciation, which happened in 1996 until today, has produced a lot of imbalances within the economy. We decimated the manufacturing sector, although the decimation of manufacturing sector had already started with the silly attempts of Mrs. Thatcher to smash some parts of the economy. But you know, this inflation targeting period has not improved the manufacturing sector. On the contrary, it really decimated the manufacturing sector and pushed the service sector upwards, and helped it if you like, but also we've had problems in terms of the balance of payments. So these imbalances in the economy have been created because of this particular framework that we have been pursuing. Other problems that we see is that, this assumption that these people make, that the only objective of a central bank is price stabilization, and that once you've achieved price stabilization, everything else follows. There is a very important assumption by these people, and a lot of central bankers even, Bernanke in the United States is a very good example, where achieving price stability is everything. Don't worry about output stabilization. In our dual mandate, he would argue, so long as we achieve price stability, everything else would follow. And then, you know, poor us, we say, let's look at examples in the world history and see whether once you've achieved price stabilization, there is this huge improvement in the rest of the economy. And you don't need me to remind you of the experience of the 1930s. The 20s was a period of extreme price stability in many countries, United States, Britain, and so on and so forth. Look what happened in the 30s. More recently, we had the example of Japan. Japan had enormous price stability, and then look what happened. The Japanese economy is suffering to this day from the depression that they had in the 90s. Look at, in 1997, the Southeast Asian crisis. There had been enormous price stability prior to 1997, and all suddenly we had this huge problem in terms of the financial crisis, a problem that a lot of these countries to this day, Joseph Stiglitz was reminding us the other day, are still suffering from. And more important, we had the nice decade, as I suggested earlier, wonderful decade with price stability. And what happened in August 2007? the problems that Paul talked about yesterday, and we are in the midst of it. We had price stability, and everybody was congratulating the central banks for having achieved this enormous price stability, and all suddenly we've had the problems since then. So these new consensus macroeconomics, I would suggest to you, is suffering from many, many problems, but for us Keynesians, the most important problem, I think, is that this way of doing macroeconomics and monetary policy in particular has created a situation, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, of enormous debt within the economy. And trying to sort out problems through simply manipulating the rate of interest, where you have to have enormous changes in the rate of interest, creates all sorts of problems with this way of doing policy. When the rate of interest is extremely low, a huge amount of debt is created in the economy. When central banks realize that the rate of interest has to come down, all sorts of changes in the rate of interest take place. And in the process, there are a lot of people that are hurt. The subprime US mortgage market, for example, where a lot of people lost their homes, and these people are not rich people who can afford many houses. These are the weaker members of our society, so that this continuous manipulation in the rate of interest to affect economic magnitudes, it creates these distributional problems in our economic system, which we as Keynesians, we would prefer not to have. And finally, what about fiscal policy? In this particular framework, fiscal policy disappears. It has been downgraded completely, and of course monetary policy has been upgraded quite substantially. Now this downgrade of fiscal policy has come about for two reasons. First is because there is crowding out. If you change government expenditure, for example, an equivalent amount of private expenditure moves the opposite way, and at the end of the day, you achieve nothing. Most importantly, however, the assumption that these people make is that all of us, all people in the economy, are regardians. We know exactly how the economy works. The minute the government changes the tax rate or changes its government expenditure behavior, we know exactly what will happen. If they increase government expenditure, they would have to increase taxes tomorrow, and consequently we are going to respond, we, clever, regardian individuals, in such a way as to destroy completely the attempts of the government to stabilize the economy. So long as you have regardians fiscal policy in this argument, don't use it. What you do with fiscal policy, try to have zero deficits in the work of the government, but maybe you should have a little bit of surplus when the going is good, just in case you need to use some of your, just in case you need to create deficit in the future. So in other words, balance your books and don't worry about fiscal policy. In the United Kingdom, what we do with fiscal policy, we say, yes, of course we balance our books, but over the cycle. Not day to day or quarter to quarter or year in, year out. Over the cycle, we like to have a balanced budget. But then you see more recently, even proponents of this approach, they say, cannot be that everybody is regardian. Let us assume that some people are not regardian. Let us assume that a certain percentage of the population belong to a non-regardian group. What happens then? Fiscal policy is wonderful. And therefore there is gradually, now as we talk, there are people who say, hang on a minute, maybe this notion about fiscal policy, we were wrong after all. And under different assumptions, more realistic assumptions, maybe fiscal policy is important. But for the proponents, the majority of the proponents of this particular school, fiscal policy is not to be used. It should be used the way I described it, and I think that is completely wrong. Fiscal policy is important, can be used, and we are looking forward to have another piece of evidence that fiscal policy can do the trick. And that is next month when in the United States the policymakers rely on fiscal policy after all these years of forget about fiscal policy to do a little bit of the trick. That we wait and see. So what have I done? I argued that there is this new consensus in macroeconomics, that there is a way of describing it, but you have to be extremely careful about the assumptions that these people make to reach the results that they do reach. And in doing so, I hope I have exposed some of those assumptions in pretty much agreement with what Paul was saying yesterday of the importance of those assumptions. But when you change those assumptions to be more realistic, I'm afraid, or delighted, that the results you get at the end of the day are very, very different from what this new consensus in macroeconomics would have us believe. And with that, I thank you very much for listening, and I'll stop.
Off by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I think it's a very important day in Brazilian economics where we're looking to establish Keynesian economics, and it may therefore seem strange that I'm going to present a paper where demand is only mentioned once, and I've just mentioned it. The title, Technical Change in the Aggregate Production Function, that is the title of one of the 5 most influential papers in neoclassical growth theory. It is Solow's 1957 paper, published in, I think it was the Review of Economics and Statistics. What I'm going to do is to argue that a lot of neoclassical economics, macroeconomics, is not even wrong. And I will come on in a minute to say what I mean by not even wrong, which is also a famous quote. One of my colleagues at Cambridge, Tony Lawson, talks about ground clearing in methodology. And I always thought this was a very subtle metaphysical term that I didn't quite understand. So I asked him about it. He says, oh, no. If you want to establish a new theory, you've got to get rid of the deadwood of the old theory. This is a modest contribution in trying to get rid of the deadwood. The phrase, not even wrong, actually comes from physics. It was the physicist Wolfgang Pauli who was renowned for being a tough audience. He exclaimed wrong, or completely wrong. You'll notice my German is not good enough that I'm not going to attempt the German. When he disagreed with a speaker. Near the end of his life, when asked his opinion of a recent article by a younger physicist, he said, sadly, "It is not even wrong." So a scientific idea is not even wrong if it is so incomplete that it cannot be used to make predictions that could be compared to observations to see if the idea is wrong, if it is not even testable. I am going to argue that the neoclassical production function is not even wrong. Now, just to reminisce a little bit, I first gave a very similar lecture about 7 years ago in Salvador, and also to the department here. And I was faced with a bit of a dilemma. Do I go on to do some more recent work that I have done with a co-author? We've got a book coming out on this, which is inevitably more technical, or do I go back and just go through the fundamentals of the argument? I decided, given the audience, perhaps to go through the fundamentals, so I must apologize to those of you who've already heard these arguments before, that I will be repeating some of them, but at the end, there is something that's new. So what I want to do is look at the aggregate production function and to extend some criticisms. These are not new criticisms, these are not new criticisms. I'd be a bit worried if I was the only person arguing this. But they can be traced back to the 1940s, an economist called Reeder. And the other names associated with this are Phelps Brown, who was professor, I think, at the LSE, well, he was a Labour economist anyway, Anwar Sheikh of the New School, and Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize winner. Paul said, I think, yesterday that he had 3 Nobel Prize winners on his side. I've got 1, but I've got a Bates Medal winner as well in Franklin Fisher. But I still need some more help. And I'm going to show by means of a simulation exercise, which will be the last part of the talk, why things are so, why the aggregate production function can be misleading. To start with, just let me take you through a thought experiment. There is a first-year economist, I think in America they're called doing Eco 101, is that right? In Cambridge it's Part 1A. I don't know what a first year would be doing now. And has to do a statistical project. And she's heard of Keynes and demand-orientated growth, so she decides that she would like to test whether demand was actually important in growth. So what she does is she thinks, well, demand, that's consumption, investment demand, government expenditure, net exports. So she goes to national accounts and she calculates the growth rates of these, and then she runs a regression, and she regresses the growth of output on the growth of consumption, the growth of exports, net exports, the growth of investment, and the growth of government expenditure. And she gets an R-squared of 1. And the T statistics are phenomenal, 253 on all of them. And she goes to her instructor and says, look, this confirms Keynesian economic growth theory. Demand is essentially important. And so the instructor looks and says very sadly, well, I'm very sorry, but you know what you've done? You've estimated an identity. And an identity will give you an R-squared of 1. It tells you absolutely nothing in a sense of a behavioral test. The only reason you've got some variation in your coefficients is the shares are not perfectly stable. My argument, I'm afraid, is that neoclassical growth theories have been doing exactly the same with the production function, but without realizing what they're doing. So, going right back to first principles, what is a production function? I've put here that it's the relationship between the outputs and inputs, but in physical terms. At its real core, it is an engineering function. It relates physical inputs and outputs and is a microeconomic function. And with the standard notation, we normally get a production function in the terms of technical change, capital, and labor. And one particular form is the Cobb-Douglas. I will be referring to the Cobb-Douglas a lot, but it is not, this argument does not depend upon the Cobb-Douglas. Sorry, can I just... now, a lot of people have actually said, well, production functions don't exist for purely theoretical reasons. Alan Walters in Econometrica in 1963 said this. Franklin Fisher has been saying it, I was going to say ad nauseum, but in a large number of papers since the late 60s, where he has actually shown that even taking a Cobb-Douglas, can we sum it to get an aggregate Cobb-Douglas under realistic assumptions? And he says, in real economies, aggregate production functions are a non-event. Even more recently, he says they're an unpersuasive fairy tale because the conditions for aggregation are so serious that even if you have well-defined microproduction functions, you cannot aggregate them up to give a sensible aggregate production function. He goes even further. He says they won't even give you good approximations. He says if you want it to be approximation, your partial derivatives do such strange things that you just simply wouldn't believe that they exist. The second criticism is the Cambridge capital theory controversies. Can I just ask how many here have actually heard of the Cambridge capital controversies? Oh dear. It's a paradox that in the 1970s, when I was looking at some third-year undergraduate textbooks, they all mentioned the Cambridge capital theory controversies, and most of them mentioned aggregation problems. Pick up a book now like Barrow and Sally Martin, you'll find no reference to any of these criticisms whatsoever. It's not that they've been refuted, they've just been ignored. I call this professional amnesia. And when I'm talking to students, I just simply say, well, it's not surprising that aggregate production functions don't exist. I mean, what sense does it make to combine mining, manufacturing, and services into a single industry? Do we really believe all countries have the same aggregate production function as Mankiw, Roman Wheel assume? Does it make sense to aggregate textiles and apparel industry and oil refinery and talk about some sort of aggregate elasticity of substitution of this combined industry? Are we sitting here as part of a Cobb-Douglas? Are we an educational Cobb-Douglas production function? I'm skeptical, anyway. So why do people still use it? Well, because it works, in that it gives good statistical fits with plausible results. I said, what do we mean by plausible? Well, Solow remarked to Fisher that if we found the coefficient of labour as 0.25 and capital as 0.75, we would not now be talking about production functions. What I'm going to show later in this talk, hopefully, is you cannot find a production function where the coefficient on labour is not 0.75. Anyway, and the other defence is, well, you know, Friedman's instrumentalism, every model needs simplifying assumptions, and what matters is the predictive success of the model. And Gregory Mankiw says this quite explicitly. I've always found the high R-squared reassuring when I teach the Solow growth model. Surely a low R-squared in this regression would have shaken my faith that this model has much to teach us about international differences in income. So here you have a clear statement, regardless of the aggregation problems, regardless of the capital controversies, regardless of the fact that some people don't think they exist, when we come to run one of the many estimates of production functions, we generally get good R-squareds. So it passes this test with flying colours, and a Friedmanite would say, in that case, it is a meaningful concept. Well, I say it passes the test with flying colours, but I think the question is, does it? Well, production functions really started with Cobb and Douglas in it's either 22, 28, slips my mind. And again, as I said, they should be estimated using physical data. But invariably, we don't have physical data. We have to aggregate. Even at the most elementary level, if you want to even look at the production function for cars, you have different types of cars, different specifications, so what you do is you aggregate them using prices. So monetary values, even constant prices, are used as proxies for the physical data. Now, some people think this is totally innocuous. Charles Ferguson, a very notable neoclassical economist who wrote the neoclassical theory of distribution, production and distribution, actually admits this. We have engineering production functions, but then we move seamlessly to using value. However, the problem is that you have in equation 1 a well-known relationship, which is the Cobb-Douglas, and you've also got a definition that's true, which is the accounting identity. So that value added is definitionally related to employment and capital through equation 2. Now, I've used V and J to signify values and Q and K to signify physical magnitudes. And could this be a problem? Because you'll notice you have two equations with three variables that are exactly the same, V, L, and J. And we know that one is an identity and must always hold regardless of whether there are any production functions or not. In other words, an identity is something you can't refute. You can't use it to be tested. And in fact, this point was first made by Reeder in the 1940s. Phelps Brown, in a rather difficult to read paper, to say the least, buried in it, you'll find a couple of arguments where he says that in fact the national income identity, the identity and the production function are the same side or different sides of the same coin. And what he actually said was, well, look, we've got the output elasticity of a Cobb-Douglas production function, and that is defined as dV by dL times L by V. If factors are paid their marginal products, and this is a big if, dV by dL equals W equals the wage rate, then the output elasticity, the alpha, must equal the share of labour in national income. This is the standard first-year Euler condition, if you like, marginal productivity, first-order conditions. But Phelps says, well, look, but hey, you've got a national income identity, which is also true. And if you just differentiate that, there's no economics or behavioral foundations to it at all. dV by dL equals the wage rate. And if we simply calculate dV by dL divided by L by V, which is, in inverted commas, an output elasticity, we get it equal to A. Now, what Herbert, Simon, and Levy said was that the causation is not from having a well-defined Cobb-Douglas which satisfies all the conditions of perfect competition and the marginal productivity theory of pricing, so which you get the output elasticity equals the observed factor share. Causation is precisely the other way around. What you have is you have a national income identity, and that can be approximated as a Cobb-Douglas. So all you are picking up when you estimate this is, in effect, the data that you're using that is must hold by definition. Now, there's a very short note in 1963 where they use a Taylor series expansion to actually show how you get from the national income identity to the Cobb-Douglas, which I have not going to go into today. What I want to do is something a little bit simpler. But we have something which I and my colleague have called the equifinality theorem. It's always good to have a theorem, even if you haven't got any maths in the paper. What we say is you get the same results from using the aggregate production function and from the national accounting identity, but the latter has no behavioral foundations and must always hold. So regardless of what your production function looks like, even if it doesn't exist, you will always get statistically these results. So let me just try and make this a little bit more concrete. Here we have the data for UK total industry. We've got value added, we've got the wage rate, we've got persons employed, the rate of profit, capital stock, capital output ratio, all the data's there. And what I'm saying is you've got two accounting identities. You've got equation 1, which is the normal accounting identity. And if we use that with our observed data, we get the total output of the United Kingdom is £519,089 million in 1990 prices. Actual prices don't matter, it's just the example. If we use equation 2, which is just an approximation for equation 1, and put in precisely the same figures, we get precisely the same value add. So in other words, if we look at this here, which is our accounting identity, we look at this. This is slightly rather more complex, but in a sense it reduces to this, which looks very much like our old friend the Cobb-Douglas. Put these figures in both of them and you get precisely the same result to the nearest pound. That is because at any point in time, this is just a mathematical transformation of that. No economics in it at all. Here I just put it slightly more succinctly. For any point t, the identity is exactly equal to what we would call the Cobb-Douglas, and it gives us exactly the same figure. So it's a mathematical transformation. Now, the point is, because we're using 1 year, factor shares do not change. But if they don't change or over time, or there's no pronounced trend, then you can see why the accounting identity will give us a very good Cobb-Douglas. But the causation here is from the aggregate accounting identity to an aggregate production function. It's not the other way around, as neoclassical theory would tell us. So how is it that the Cobb-Douglas is merely picking up the identity? Well, if we believe there was a Cobb-Douglas, the relationship between productivity and the capital labor ratio is given by the line CD, the solid line. And neoclassical theory would tell us, of course, that there is an accounting identity, and at the point of tangency, would be where the two are equal. But what is actually happening is that we have a linear equation, which is our accounting identity, which is this line here. And if we let the capital labor ratio change, these are the points that we've actually got, and they actually lie on this linear relationship. If we then come along and try and put a statistical Cobb-Douglas to it, well, of course, the best fit will be shifted upwards. It will be something like that. And what Herbert Simon did, he said, well, given that our accounting identity would have an R-squared of 1, what error would be introduced by estimating the production function EF? So he took a number of variables of the capital labor ratio, which are far greater than you get in reality, and he calculated that the error was less than 5%. In other words, putting the misspecification in, you would get an R-squared of 0.95. The same argument holds for time series. If we have a production function with Q and K, we just simply differentiate it and we can express it in terms of that output is a function of labor and capital. Under neoclassical assumptions, alpha equals A, the factor shares. And so we get the standard result. For the identity, which holds for all states of competition, and whether or not there is an aggregate production function, and I cheat a little bit here because let's just write V equals Q and J equals K, as common in the literature. That, differentiating it, again with no behavioral assumptions, will give you a regression. This is an identity which is the relationship between output, the growth of wages, the growth of profit, the growth of labor, and capital. And again, the question arises, well, if we look at this equation and we go back, I'm not very good at doing these. Can I go back with these? Well, if we go back and look at the other one, you'll see that they look remarkably similar. Could the estimation of the aggregate production function be simply picking up the underlying identity? So that's what we're comparing. In fact, it looks very much, remember these are general equations, these fit CS or translog or whatever, it looks very much that the identity which must be true is actually what is generating the results of the production function. The specific example, the Cobb-Douglas, if firms employ a constant markup pricing policy, which is probably not too controversial, then we know that the factor shares will be stable in the aggregate. If the trend rate of growth of wages is roughly constant and the rate of profit over time does not vary, then our identity, which is the top equation, can actually be written as the second equation. So the identity holds absolutely with certainty, given these two assumptions that have nothing to do with neoclassical production theory. They are, if you like, Caldor stylized facts, and you end up with a Cobb-Douglas production function. So the equifinality theorem says that a condition of constant factor shares and a constant growth rate of the weighted wage and profit rates is not met. Even if we don't get that, we can find a more flexible function to the accounting identity than given by the Cobb-Douglas. And the CES production function, although you don't think of it in these terms, is nothing other than a Box-Cox transformation, what a mathematician would call a Box-Cox transformation. And in other words, again, no behavioral contact. Why do we always do not get a perfect fit to the Cobb-Douglas? There are two reasons. One is that factor shares vary and are not being tracked accurately. The second is the linear time trend for technical change does not approximate to the weighted wage rate and the rate of profit. It seems from a lot of simulation exercises that empirically 2 is the case. What prevents you getting the very good relationship in a lot of time series is that there is a large fluctuation in wages and the rate of profit over time that is not picked up by the conventional linear time trend that goes into a production function. I'm going to skip that. All right, I said this would be a little bit new. This is a simulation experiment to try and convince you that what I'm saying is not just smoke and mirrors. And what I'm going to do is start off with some hypothetical data. And this is going to be measured in physical terms. And the true underlying technology of each firm is a Cobb-Douglas production function. Now, it doesn't need to be, but I'm going to take that because I'm going to give the neoclassical argument as much leeway as I can. Now, it's not known to the researcher because all you get as a researcher is the value data, but I, as the creator, know precisely what the true underlying technology is. Now, in our hypothetical world, firms employ a constant markup pricing policy. And this gives the output in value terms. And with a known rate of profit, which I'm going to assume is 10%, we can also calculate the value of the capital stock. So what I'm going to do is, I know for certain the physical inputs and outputs, and through a constant markup pricing policy, we can then generate the relationship, the data that the researcher is going to use to estimate the production function. And using these values, we can then estimate the rate of technical progress and the output elasticities and the degree of returns to scale. And what the simulation is going to show is they differ very markedly from the true values that we know. So the true production function at the micro level is a Cobb-Douglas. Now notice that what I've done is that the elasticity on labor is 0.25 in my world, and on capital it's 0.75. In other words, it is the opposite of what you find for the factor shares. Factor shares are value measures, remember, where the share of labor is 0.75 and the share of capital is 0.25. To generate my value, we need to put in the markup pricing, and I put in a markup pricing on unit labor costs. Markup is 0.33. That will generate a share of labor of 0.75, a constant share. It'll also obviously generate a constant share of capital of 0.25. I generate my value added. Through generating the price, we then multiply that by the output and sum it to get the value. The rate of profit is assumed to be 10%, and the value of the capital stock is simply taken as the value of output minus labor's contribution divided by the rate of profit, which is actually a common way of doing it. Frank Fisher does it in his simulations. So just recap, I've got a true production function. The output elasticity on labor is 0.25, and on capital is 0.75, opposite of the factor shares. Then we generate our value judgment, and then we tell our researcher to go away and estimate the production function. This is just, I'm afraid, just repeating again what I said earlier. The shares are 0.75 and 0.25, and the output elasticities are 0.25 and 0.75. So using the hypothetical data, we aggregate the micro-production functions and we estimate the aggregate production function. Look at the results, what we get. Right, 10 minutes. Probably less than that, actually. What we found with the value data is that the share or the output elasticity on labor is 0.75. It's not 0.25, which is the output elasticity of every single micro-production function. It's now 0.75. The output elasticity, inverted commas, on the capital share is not 0.75, which is what every micro-production function has. It's 0.25. So what we have got is a very well-defined production function using cross-sectional data where, quote, our output elasticities are exactly equal to our factor shares. Now, neoclassical economists such as Paul Douglas would jump up and down, get very excited and say this confirms that firms are perfectly competitive and profit maximize, and that labor is paid its due reward, which is its marginal product. In fact, if you look at some of his work that's summarized in 1948. It's not often known that if you look at in some of the papers in the 1930s, Douglas, with a number of collaborators, estimated literally hundreds and hundreds of these cross-sectional production functions. And he got very good fits, not quite as good as my fit. My fit is not perfect because to estimate it, I've had to put an error term in the simulations. But he gets very, very close fits to this, and they're summarized in his Journal of Political Economy article in 1976. But things get even worse, or better. Even if the true output elasticities exhibit increasing returns to scale, we get the same estimates. In other words, what I then said was, well, let's have our micro-production functions, alpha equals 0.3, and well, it's not, it's beta equals 0.9, so the degree of returns to scale is 1.2. Each micro-production function has a degree of returns of 1.2, which is quite substantial. Markup is again a third. When you estimate it, you get exactly the same results, 0.75, 0.25. The only thing that changes is the intercept. Now, being a non-neoclassical, I don't even like micro-production functions, because think of a micro-production function. Think of a production function for an oil refinery in physical terms. Is it going to look like a Cobb-Douglas production function? Think of the pipes. You have to have fixed coefficients, different types of crap machinery. So what I said was that, well, there is a production function, but it's so complex that we can't model it. So let us generate the physical Q, physical output, the physical labor, and the physical capital as random variables. They are all random variables. So there is, my actual physical data doesn't give me a well-defined production function. If I then go through exactly the same procedure, even though no micro-production function exists, I get a perfect Cobb-Douglas. Exactly the same results as I get, even if the production function, even though the macro-production function will give me a well-defined Cobb-Douglas, even though the micro-production functions don't exist, or they are so complex that we can't model them. So I'm coming near the end of the talk. What I also did was calculate the growth of total factor productivity, the true growth. This is technical change. And that is calculated for each firm using the physical growth of output, labor, and capital with the relevant output elasticities. I know what the true values are, the researcher doesn't. The researcher just uses the empirical value data that he's got. And what I find is that the true growth of total factor productivity, technical change, is 0.5 percentage point per annum. But using the aggregate value data, which is all the researcher has, the figure comes out as nearly 1.5%, i.e. 3 times as great. So my hypothetical world is not being mirrored in the research results that are being used. So again, if we don't believe in production functions, then this explains precisely why we have a whole host of series of estimates that actually give us quite good results, that actually look like Cobb-Douglas production functions, or CS production functions, or translog, you name it, we can model it. There have been other simulation studies. They're slightly different from the one I've done, since they don't actually use markup and a pricing policy. But just to mention some of them, Frank Fisher in 1971 did a simulation where he aggregated micro-production functions under conditions where he said theoretically the aggregate cannot exist, and when he then used his data he found a very good fit. He again said that the causation is from the stability of the factor shares to the Cobb-Douglas, not the other way around. Franklin Fisher, probably the grand old man of aggregation economics, MIT, has an office just down the corridor from Robert Solow. And in the 50s, when Solow was doing his growth theory, actually pointed out to Solow that he didn't think that what he was doing was very sensible. And if you actually read Solow's 57 article, he does have a sort of apology at the beginning where he says, you either believe in this or you don't. And I believe it in until something better comes along. And I think that was really the influence of Franklin Fisher. What we're saying here is nothing better is going to come along because an identity will always give you a very, very good fit. Nelson and Winter, in a book that should have had a much greater impact than it did, An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change, had firms that had fixed coefficients, and they had a sort of search procedure where firms looked for more advanced technologies depending upon the wages, etc. But the key thing was they had fixed coefficients, and then they used that to estimate Cobb-Douglas production functions, and lo and behold, they got very, very good fits. The reason, although they didn't state it, was that the factor shares were constant. The factor shares were giving you this spurious Cobb-Douglas production function. Anwar Shaikh, who I think ought to have a lot of credit for, I mean, his paper in 74, yes, I think, although he didn't take it that much further, I think it was a very important paper, has done a similar exercise in a symposium we had in 2005 that's been published in the Eastern Economic Journal. The problem with Anwar's paper was that there was a one-page rejoinder by Robert Solow that started off, Mr. Shaikh is wrong, pure and simple. And nobody reads beyond that first statement. Unfortunately, Anwar was not wrong, pure and simple. In fact, he was right, pure and simple. Secondly, Solow dismisses this as all ideological claptrap, like the capital theory controversies. But of course, that assumes that there is some sort of body of economic thought that is totally ideologically free. Well, there may be, but I haven't come across it yet. So the implications, if we believe in this critique, it means that nearly all of neoclassical macroeconomics is not even wrong. It includes labor demand functions, real business cycle, neoclassical growth theory. Just open the standard first-year macro textbook by Mankiw and put a line through everything that has an aggregate production function or is derived from an aggregate production function and see what is left. It's not very much. And it's still a burning policy issue, and I will come back, I will finish by just actually going back to Keynes and something Paul Davidson was saying. That there's a paper in the Economic Record about 3 years ago, which is the leading, I think it's the leading Australian economic journal, where the two authors estimated a labor demand function. They regressed the log of labor on output and wages, and they used all the latest sophisticated co-integration and all these sort of techniques. And they found a coefficient on the wage was minus, was negative and very well determined. So they said this proved that if real wages rise, employment falls. Therefore, not axiomatically, empirically, a lot of Australian unemployment is due to real wages being too high. Now, the last paper, probably the last paper Yesu, Philippi and I have written is to show that this result stems purely from an identity. And you cannot estimate a labor demand function that does not have a negative coefficient on the real wage. So I would normally end on a more modest note, and I would say, as we do in our papers, that this suggests that aggregate production functions are problematical. To this audience, can I just say they're a complete waste of time? Thank you.